With the massive impact that the Italians have had on the world throughout history, it can be easy to assume that the history of the nation of Italy is indeed ancient. However, while Italian culture and its predecessors have undeniably storied roots, the country of Italy is among the youngest nations in Europe. For most of its history, Italy was not a unified state, but a geographic denomination on which a collection of city-states, dukedoms, small kingdoms and republics coexisted, often clashing amongst each other as pawns of larger European nation-states and empires. That was until the 19th century, when the long-divided peninsula finally merged into the modern nation-state we know today. This series will explore the major military conflicts that led to Italian unification. The first episode will focus on failed yet important attempts to unite the peninsula between the years 1815 to 1848. Ever since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and throughout the Middle Ages and early modern era, the Italian peninsula was a fractured land. However, while politically divided, the region's inhabitants shared a common religious and cultural background, and the Italians were aware of this shared heritage. For example, in the late Middle Ages, artists, philosophers and authors such as Dante Alighieri or Niccolo Machiavelli yearned for some form of political union, or at least considered the Italians to belong to a single nation. However, the general populace, and the local governments for that matter, never considered the possibility of uniting into a single polity. This state of affairs gradually started to change in the 19th century with the emergence of the Risorgimento, or resurgence, an ideological movement marked by patriotic sentiment and a drive towards the progressive constitutional rule. The origins of Risorgimento as an idea can be said to have originated with a certain Corsican artillery officer. One of the consequences of Napoleon's campaigns in Italy in 1796, 1797 and 1800 was the creation of two large vassal states, at the expense of previously existing entities, the Italian Republic, later the Kingdom of Italy in the north, and the Kingdom of Naples in the south. Whilst subject to French control, these two states advanced the idea of Italian national consciousness and fostered progressive ideas inspired by the French Revolution amongst the middle classes and military officers. These states were short-lived, however, and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Council of Vienna reinstated the status quo in the peninsula. From north to south, what we call Italy was divided into 12 territories. The Kingdom of Sardinia, also known as Piedmont-Sardinia, ruled by the House of Savoy. The Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, a vassal state of the Austrian Empire. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, under the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, and thus also tied to the Austrian Empire. The four small duchies of Modena, Parma, Massa and Lucca were governed by the cadet branches of the Habsburgs and the Bourbon. The Papal States occupied much of central Italy and were ruled by the Pope. In the south was the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily, which would unite in 1816 under the Bourbon. Finally, squeezed amongst these states, only two small republics survived: Cospaia, absorbed by the Papal States in 1826, and San Marino, still independent to this day. Except for the latter two micro-states, all of these Italian polities were governed as police states by absolute monarchies, relics of the Ancien Régime, which the French Revolution and Napoleon had temporarily wiped out. The rule of these monarchs was enforced by the presence of an Austrian army in Lombardy and Venetia, 100,000 men strong, ready to repress any progressive or patriotic movements, which they believed would undermine Austrian control in the Italian peninsula. The first uprisings, driven by constitutional and liberalist ideals, took place in 1820 and 1821. The spark that ignited them took place not in Italy, but in Cadiz, southern Spain, on the 1st of January 1820, an event known as the Pronunciamiento. As former Spanish colonies throughout South America rose in revolution to become independent nations, a group of Spanish officers mutinied, refusing to be deployed overseas to smash the rebels. This insubordination evolved into a large-scale insurrection, demanding that a constitution be written to limit the absolute powers of the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII. This revolt would be quashed in August of 1823 with the intervention of reactionary troops, mainly French, dispatched by the powers of the Holy Alliance, Austria, Prussia and Russia. The Spanish pronunciamiento, however, inspired the outbreak of 3 insurrections in the Italian states. The first one kicked off in Sicily on the 15th of June 1820. There, the rebels succeeded in establishing a local parliament and reinstating the Sicilian constitution of 1812, which had been abrogated after the defeat of Napoleon. However, these Sicilian insurgents had no grand designs for a united Italy. On the contrary, they pursued Sicilian independence from the Bourbon Neapolitan kingdom in the south of mainland Italy. Meanwhile, Naples itself was also going through an upheaval. On the 1st of July, a group of officers belonging to the secret societies of the Carbonari and the Freemasons rallied their soldiers and wrested control of several cities from loyalist troops. On the 6th of July, King Ferdinand I of Naples, unable to contain these shadowy insurgents, was forced to promulgate a constitution limiting his power. As this was all happening, the Holy Alliance looked on in disdain. The rulers of Prussia, Russia and Austria were all absolute monarchies who wanted to crush liberal and constitutional movements before they spread to their respective heartlands. To that end, an army of 50,000 Austrians invaded the Italian south, 12,000 of which clashed with the rebel army at the Battle of Rieti from the 7th to the 9th of March 1821. The Austrians emerged victorious, and after mopping up the remaining resistance on the Volturno River, they entered Naples on the 24th of March. King Ferdinand abrogated the constitution which had just been forced on him, and his chief of police, the Prince of Canossa, launched a campaign of executions and mass arrests. Subsequently, the Bourbons, always with Austrian support, regained control of Sicily. Although the first 2 uprisings in Naples and Sicily failed, soon after a 3rd uprising took place in Turin, the capital of the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. The leader of this plot was an officer and politician named Santoro de Santa Rosa. His plan was to force the local Savoy monarchy to issue a constitution, and then lead the kingdom into declaring war against the Austrians, thus liberating Lombardy-Venetia from their rule. To that end, Santa Rosa needed allies within the royal family. Not trusting King Victor Emmanuel I, he enlisted a prince from a cadet branch of the Savoys, Charles Albert, who had expressed liberalist sympathies. In March of 1821, garrisons loyal to Santa Rosa mutinied in several cities, including Turin. This was a significant event, for it was here that the Italian tricolour flag was flown for the first time. Santa Rosa's rebels pressured Victor Emmanuel I to concede the constitution, but instead of yielding, he abdicated the throne in favour of his brother Charles Felix. However, at the time, Felix was in the Duchy of Modena. Hence, Santa Rosa's royal ally, Charles Albert, took the regency, approving the demands for a constitutional government and appointing Santa Rosa as his war minister. Unfortunately, the liberal phase of the young prince was short-lived. Obeying orders from Charles Felix, Prince Albert slipped out of Turin and joined a loyalist contingent in Navarra. Backed by Austrian troops, the anti-constitutionalist army marched back into Turin, restoring Charles Felix as an absolute monarch. Charles Albert would eventually ascend to the throne in Turin in April of 1831, and for the first part of his reign, he would continue to uphold his most recent reactionary anti-liberal stance. The defeats suffered in 1821 and 1831 convinced Italian patriots to adopt a change of strategy. Thus far, insurrections had relied on networks created by secret societies, supported from mutinied military units, and unreliable support from wavering monarchs. Whilst all these elements were highly impactful if applied effectively, it was becoming clear that a movement for constitutional reform and national unification could not be carried by only the fringes of society and required vast popular participation involving all social classes. The chief proponent of this new approach was a former member of the Carbonari secret society, Giuseppe Mazzini, now exiled in France. According to him, the historical mission of the entire Italian people was to tear down the 2 pillars of the ancient regime, the old order, the Austrian Empire and the Church. In the summer of 1831, Mazzini founded a new society, the Young Italy. Its symbol was the Italian tricolour. Its founding principles were liberty, independence, and unity. Mazzini and the Young Italy movement managed to recruit numerous proselytes in the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, where they organized their first republican plot in April of 1833. This plan was discovered and crushed in its inception, but Mazzini was not deterred. The following year, Mazzini organized a second insurrection to take place on the 3rd of February. Some 100 young Italians, alongside French volunteers, tried to enter Piedmont, while the Savoy fleet was incited to mutiny in Genova. The man in charge of this latter action was a young navy officer, Giuseppe Garibaldi. But the Piedmontese police had infiltrated the conspirators, so this insurrection also failed, and Garibaldi was forced to flee to Marseille. Allegedly, whilst hunted by the Piedmontese, Garibaldi still found the time to have 3 flings in a single day. In any case, the young officer later escaped to Russia and then South America, where he would become a legendary military leader fighting for the Republic of Rio Grande do Sul and Uruguay. We will check back on Garibaldi's story when we reach the year 1848. As for Mazzini, he moved from exile to exile, first to Switzerland and then to Great Britain in 1840. There he planned another phase of operations, launching further insurrections, all doomed to fail, first in the Papal States in 1843, then in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in 1844, and finally once more in the Pope's territories in 1845. The failure of these actions convinced other patriots that insurrectionism was not the answer to Italian woes, nor was unification the only attainable goal. Clergyman Vincenzo Gioberti, for example, advocated for a confederation of Italian states, with loose political guidance from the Pope and military leadership provided by the Savoy dynasty in Turin. Piedmontese statesman Massimo d'Azeglio also supported a federalist approach, this time firmly led by the Savoy kings. Finally, philosopher Carlo Cattaneo was a proponent of a federation ruled by a president, taking the United States as a model. Patriots across the peninsula raised their hopes in June 1846 with the election of Pope Pius IX. Whilst not a progressive at heart, the new pope did institute some liberal reforms. For example, he declared an amnesty for political prisoners, lifted censorship on the press, and appointed a progressive cardinal as his Secretary of State. Due to this dynamic pope's actions, Italians began to dream about uniting Italy and uniformly reforming society across the peninsula once more, with their new Holy Pontiff at the head of this revolution. In 1847, following a sweeping economic crisis affecting much of Europe, demonstrations and riots broke out in the Papal States and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and Piedmont. In response, the Pope and the Grand Duke allowed some concessions to the moderate protesters, thus isolating the more radical and republican elements. But this was not enough to quell the revolutionary sentiment, which would flare up again in Italy alongside the rest of Europe in 1848. That year, revolutions opposing absolute monarchies broke out throughout the continent, one of the first being the Palermo insurrection on the 12th of January 1848, when the Bourbon king Ferdinand II was forced to concede a constitution on the 29th of January. Thereafter, domino pieces fell one by one, with constitutions promulgated in Rome, Florence and Turin. By conceding the so-called Albertine Statute on the 4th of March 1848, King Charles Albert finally returned to his liberal sympathetic roots and took a decisive step towards forwarding patriotic and constitutionalist causes. That same month, Charles Albert would be compelled to further action when northern Italy was shaken by 2 further large-scale upheavals. First, on the 17th of March, the Venetians rebelled against Austrian rule, expelling the local garrison and declaring themselves the Republic of San Marco. But what propelled Charles Albert to involve himself directly were the events taking place in Lombardy, known as the 5 Days of Milan. Tensions in Milan started escalating as early as December 1846, when a notable patriot, Count Confalonieri, died after being incarcerated by the Austrians. Imperial authorities heavily censored his epigraph and kept a close watch on the funeral procession. In protest, the Milanese decided to boycott any show at the La Scala Opera Theatre which featured Austrian singers. On the 1st of January 1848, local patriots took to boycotting other Austrian-associated entertainments, like the state lottery and tobacco. It may sound absurd, but by foregoing theatre, legalized gambling and cigars, the Milanese were effectively denying profitable tax revenues to the Austrians. 2 days later, the local Austrian garrison started harassing civilians, forcing them to smoke cigars, and in some cases even assaulting them. Riots broke out, which led to the arrest of several patriots on the 22nd. Following this, the imperial government imposed strict censorship laws in Milan to prevent further acts of protest or civil disobedience. Tension mounted until the 17th of March, when news reached Milan that an insurrection had broken out in Vienna, whose leaders were demanding constitutional reform. The Austrians, fearing a revolt in Milan, lifted some of the imposed restrictions, but this had the opposite effect. Patriots took the occasion to organize and stage a large patriotic demonstration. On the 18th, a Milanese revolutionary council, headed by Carlo Cattaneo, expelled the Austrian governor from the city, handed over power to a native mayor, Gabriele Casati, and confiscated police weapons to arm a local militia. The commander of the Austrian army in Lombardy-Venetia, Field Marshal Radetzky, responded by declaring a state of emergency. His troops, headquartered at the Sforza castle in Milan, moved out to crush the uprising, but were met with improvised barricades and fierce street fighting. By evening, they had to retreat to their castle. Fighting continued on the 19th, as Austrian cavalry rode into town. However, their momentum was broken by numerous street barricades, while Cattaneo's insurgents remained informed of their movements, having created an efficient communications network by recruiting young orphan boys to act as runners. The Milanese seized the police headquarters on the 20th, and another Austrian redoubt on the 21st, taking 160 prisoners. On the same day, the insurgents started launching hot air balloons to communicate with the surrounding countryside, inciting farmers to join the revolt. Radetzky felt the noose tighten against his garrison. On the 22nd, he ordered a retreat from Milan, but more rebels poured in from the countryside, blocking his path. A battle erupted for control of the city gates, but the Austrians managed to force their way out and eventually retreated into Venetia. On the dawn of the 23rd of March, the Milanese had full control of their city and welcomed a contingent of volunteers from the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. At this point, King Charles Albert decided to seize what was becoming a golden opportunity to boost his prestige and power, sending in his regular army to help the insurgent cities and deal the final blow to the Austrians in northern Italy. This marked the beginning of the First War of Italian Independence, the first occasion in which regular troops from Piedmont-Sardinia would square up against the Austrian Empire in the context of the Risorgimento. We will cover this conflict in a future episode, which will feature the return of one of the protagonists of Italian unification, the firebrand general Giuseppe Garibaldi, and even a special cameo from the man who created the wooden puppet who wanted to be a real boy. This is episode 1 of our member and Patreon exclusive series on the Risorgimento, the Italian Unification Wars. Our kind members and patrons are able to watch 6 episodes, showing how Italy managed to become unified after centuries of internal strife and foreign rule. We also release 3 new exclusive videos every week, including videos on the Spanish Succession, Austrian Succession, Eastern Front of World War II, Persian Wars, Punic Wars, Reconquista, Pacific War, and more. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.